Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session of our Sarah Smith Conference, Are We Safe Yet? Vulnerability and Security in an Anxious Age. In order to get us underway, I'd like to call on the Reverend Skip Masback, pastor of the First Congregational Church in New Canaan, and a member of our Board of Advisors and a dear friend of the school. Skip.
Good morning. I had only two questions when I learned that Dean Attridge and others had invited me to share a reflection this morning at 8:30. The first was, what's a reflection? And the second was, what could a local pastor possibly add to the deliberations of an assembly of experts who've devoted their careers to the cause of peace? And Dean Attridge responded, and I'm pretty sure almost all in jest, something about plowshares and swords will do for 8:30. Well, all right, I have, of course, preached on Isaiah 2, as many of you have, and probably with a similar result. Jesus may have promised that the peacemakers would be called children of God, but he also warned us that people would revile us and persecute us and utter all manner of evil against us. Like most pastors in the fall of 2002, I preached against the proposed invasion of Iraq. I had notions of moving the discussion beyond the passions and fears and anxieties and partisanship of the moment by invoking the old rubric, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus sanction the bombing of Baghdad and the killing of 100,000 Iraqis and Americans? Well, the less thoughtful of my parishioners stormed the deacon board the next night with figurative pitchforks and torches. But the most thoughtful of my parishioners sent me an email that said, Pastor, I think you have persuaded me that Jesus would not counsel war against Iraq. But I think you have also persuaded me that Jesus is too impractical for our times. I drew the following lessons from that experience. First, we are called to proclaim the cause of peace in receptive and unreceptive times. Paul knew something about the costs of preaching into a headwind, yet as he exhorted in 2 Timothy, proclaim the message, be persistent whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. Well, all right, but having said that, experience teaches us, doesn't it, that there are some times where there is just so much anxiety and so much fear that our people cannot hear, much less process, an appeal to perspective or a call for peace. So if we would be peacemakers, then yes, we must speak difficult words in times of crisis, but our work is even more urgent during interstitial times of relative calm. Your work here these 2 days is all the more important because we may, for a brief time, be in a relatively teachable moment when your message and these deliberations can be received and understood by the broader community. That's the first lesson I drew. Second, we are called to proclaim peace no matter how impractical it might seem to human eyes. Paul, of course, famously put it this way in 1 Corinthians, for the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. John Howard Yoder put it this way, the reason for accepting Jesus' way is not that it is not irrational, not that one can make a case for it on other grounds, but that it is one's confession. We confess that the God who has made himself known and has worked out our reconciliation in Christ is a God who loves his enemies at the cost of his own suffering. Well, all right, but having said that, our experience of conflict teaches time and again that human counsels of so-called pragmatism have led us into valleys of deep foolishness, and that what we had dismissed as divine foolishness would have provided the most pragmatic course of all. The catastrophe of lost blood and treasure in Iraq is only the most recent example. So if we would be peacemakers, then yes, we must follow Jesus down the impractical seeming path of vulnerability simply because it is our confession. But isn't there a case to be made to my inquiring parishioner that there is a divine wisdom in vulnerability that often does make the most pragmatic trail on the map? As John Howard Yoder argued in his essay, What Would You Do If? What's needed to reveal the inner wisdom of Christian vulnerability is a sober humility, a sensible reappraisal of our limited human capacity for disinterested calculation and execution when we unleash violence in the name of security. But of course, pride is the most resilient of human sins and humility the most elusive of human virtues. As Reinhold Niebuhr wrote, "No pastor has ever labored in his study to preach on humility, nor preached with his utmost sincerity without waiting at the back door to find out how he did." Neither Niebuhr nor Yoder meant a humility that has so much to do with a self-effacing manner on the outside as they meant a humility that has to do with a clear-eyed, hard-nosed recognition of our limitations on the inside, recognizing our human tendency to infect judgment with self-interest, to taint reason with passion, to blind vision with pride. As Reinhold Niebuhr observed, if there is a law in our members which wars against the law that is in our minds as individuals, this is even more true when we think of society. As Yoder argued, certainly anyone whose vision of the drama of human conflict is deeper than that of the television Western has some awareness of the complexity of historical causality and some notion of how seldom things turn out the way men have predicted, especially when what they have been predicting is wholesome fruit to be born of violence. A quick vignette of unintended consequences. In 1982, I read Jonathan Schell's great work, The Fate of the Earth. We're going to hear from Mr. Schell today. I was an associate in a large Washington, D.C. law firm, chafing for an opportunity to serve in the public interest, and reading the book moved me to run over to the State Department and apply for a job in the State Department Legal Advisor's Office of Nonproliferation. The interview chain led eventually to a dreary interior office where I met a then young man, Ronald Bettauer, who had the kind of earnest professional commitment to his craft that makes you think of public service as a noble endeavor. And this is what he told me during the interview. Well, actually, most of what I do and where most of our energy is going is trying to slow down the erosion of gains we made during the 70s. This administration, this Reagan administration, is now pressing to greenlight the transfer of nuclear technology to the Pakistanis. As we all know now, President Reagan, William Casey, and the Charlie Wilsons of the world saw the clear pragmatism in working through Pakistan to wound the Soviets in Afghanistan. Of course, we also know now how this story ends. Read the website entry for Mr. Bettauer's Office of Nonproliferation and Verification on the State Department website today, and you will see that the office that was once pressured to turn a blind eye to Pakistani nuclear armament is now recruiting young lawyers who would like to assist in, and I'm not making this up, read the website, quote, dismantling the AOCON nuclear black market network, close quote. Pragmatism indeed. As Miroslav put it last night, a technological means of security has morphed into a means of insecurity. We were all treated last night to one of the most generative panel discussions I have ever experienced at a conference such as this. But the panel's insights were as sobering as they were generative. To put a sharper point on some of the grave concerns expressed last night, I passed out an excerpt from Reinhold Niebuhr's The Irony of American History, written in 1952. Niebuhr examined the perils of a national security policy driven by combative idealism in the context of our Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. But his concerns presciently anticipated the dangers of our war on terror. Surveying the analytic dangers that flow from a pugilistic pride, he turned to the tempering dynamics of faith, concluding, strangely enough, none of the insights derived from this faith are finally contradictory to our purpose and duty of preserving our civilization. They are, in fact, prerequisites for saving it. For if we should perish, the ruthlessness of the foe would be only the secondary cause of the disaster. The primary cause would be that the strength of a giant nation was directed by eyes too blind to see all the hazards of the struggle, and the blindness would be induced not by some accident of nature or history, but by hatred and vainglory. And so I would say to my most thoughtful of parishioners, you are right, Jesus most certainly would not counsel war against Iraq. but you might want to rethink your conclusion that Jesus is too impractical for our times. And so I would say to you, my fellow conferees, that our work is all the more urgent precisely because we are, for the moment, between catastrophes, or as Professor Andrew Wall puts it, we are always between contingency and catastrophe. But as that doesn't make it any easier to unhorse what passes glibly for pragmatism in our national discourse, I conclude with this exhortation from Niebuhr, with which he concluded The Irony of American History. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final favor of love, which is forgiveness. May God bless our deliberations this day. Amen.
Thank you very much, Skip. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, who will be giving us an address on moral leadership and nuclear weapons. Sergio Duarte is the High Representative for Disarmament with the rank of Undersecretary General in the United Nations. He's a native of Rio de Janeiro and a career diplomat in the Brazilian Foreign Service. He's had a distinguished career dealing with these issues of disarmament in the United Nations and with the International Atomic Energy Commission. We're delighted to have him here today to address us on this very important topic. Ambassador Duarte.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning. As was announced, the title of the talk I was requested to give is Moral Leadership and Nuclear Weapons. But thinking of the overall title of this seminar, of this session that you have, Are We Safe Yet? I cannot but think, who are we? And I think that we should apply to all of mankind. We're not speaking of specific countries or specific peoples. We, at least in the United Nations, we like to think of we as meaning everyone, all nations, all peoples on earth. And I hope that we will be safe if we can be efficient in what we do regarding these issues. I am greatly honored to have this opportunity to address this distinguished audience on the subject of moral leadership and nuclear weapons. But before proceeding, I'd like to thank Tyler Wigg Stevenson for having invited me on behalf of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. And I also wish to congratulate its director, Miroslav Wolf, and Dean Harry Ettridge of the Yale Divinity School for their efforts in organizing this event. This is not my first visit to Yale. I was here last February to speak at the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization on the many challenges facing the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. The fact that two of the Yale centers have demonstrated a keen interest in disarmament is indeed gratifying, as is the fact that several renowned scholars at Yale, including Paul Kennedy and Bruce Russett, have long had an active interest in the United Nations issues. My remarks today will not be those of a scholar, philosopher, or theologian, however much I appreciate their own contributions to disarmament and the other great goals of the United Nations. I will instead speak as a practitioner, someone who has worked on disarmament and non-proliferation issues, both in multilateral arenas and in the Brazilian Foreign Ministry for over 40 years, in various capacities, sometimes more actively than others. Such is the nature of the professional life of a career diplomat. I am reminded that Jane Addams once said, "Action indeed is the sole medium of expression for ethics." And this is a good introduction to what I wish to say today. For while many words are spoken or formally adopted at the United Nations, it is in the realm of the actions and results that our real contribution to history and human welfare will ultimately be made. We should all recognize, however, that the UN organization may not be to blame for the lack of such progress, nor may it receive credit for genuine achievements. The heaviest responsibilities in the realm of action remain with our member states, whose own citizens are ultimately responsible for ensuring that those actions serve the common good. Let me begin, however, by summarizing the formal goals of the United Nations in the field of disarmament. Many people might not know that disarmament is one of the longest-standing goals at the United Nations. When Dag Hammarskjöld referred in 1955 to disarmament as a hardy perennial at the UN, it was already a decade old, appearing twice in the UN Charter. The Charter, however, was negotiated before any nuclear weapon had ever been tested. So it was perhaps not surprising that the General Assembly included the elimination of nuclear weapons and all other weapons adaptable to mass destruction, in the words of the Charter, as a goal in the first resolution that it adopted in January 1946. In 1959, the General Assembly put general and complete disarmament under effective international control on its agenda. And this term encompasses the total elimination of all weapons of mass destruction and the limitation of conventional arms to specific purposes of self-defense and peacekeeping. The final document of the General Assembly first special session on disarmament in 1978 referred to general and complete disarmament as the ultimate objective of the United Nations in this field, a goal that remains today. A great deal of what the UN does in the field of disarmament and non-proliferation is dedicated to the pursuit of those goals, along with other such mandates that we receive from the states parties to multilateral treaties. One could say that the various institutions that comprise what we call the UN disarmament machinery perform in effect as a kind of assembly line for the creation and maintenance of global norms in these fields. It is the job of the Disarmament Commission to meet once a year to deliberate 2 agenda items, typically dealing with nuclear and conventional weapons, and to seek agreement on voluntary guidelines at the end of a 3-year cycle of such meetings. The first committee of the General Assembly considers specific resolutions which, though non-binding, carry additional political weight. It is the job of the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, the world's single multilateral forum for disarmament negotiations, to produce legally binding obligations in this field. My own Office for Disarmament Affairs advises the Secretary General and undertakes numerous activities to promote disarmament. I'm here, in a sense, also promoting disarmament. These include, for example, our assistance to member states on their request in pursuing their own disarmament-related activities, our extensive administrative and substantive assistance at gatherings of states parties to multilateral treaties, our educational programs and publications, and our relations and cooperation with non-governmental groups. This is essentially what we are doing at the UN in the field of disarmament, and I have given only a brief introduction to some of the structures and processes by which we pursue this work. What immediately stands out in our work is that our goals are global in scope, and the norms we seek to pursue have been the subject of deliberations by our member states and have been converted into recommendations or binding commitments accepted by all. We are not in the business of promoting discriminatory norms. We are not seeking to outlaw certain weapons only in some countries, while certifying their legitimacy elsewhere. The norms we seek to advance at the UN are universal in scope. They advance the ideals and concrete self-interests of our member states by their very function of serving the interests of humanity. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has often referred to disarmament and non-proliferation as global public goods, precisely because their benefits are indivisible and enjoyed by all member states, and indeed by all people. Disarmament, of course, is not the only option available to states to advance their security interests. Other choices include the balance of power, the resort to military preemption, ever-expanding military expenditures, arms exports, and other such measures. In terms of weapons of mass destruction, however, disarmament has two advantages over these other options. First, it conforms to the ideal of a universal, non-discriminatory standard and to the long-standing international desire to eliminate certain types of horrific, indiscriminate weapons. And second, it happens to be the most effective, practical way to ensure against any future use of such weapons. Disarmament, in short, represents the fusion of idealism and realism. It is the right thing to do, and it works. As for nuclear non-proliferation, it gains its own collective legitimacy from its intimate connection with disarmament. The UN is not merely seeking a world in which nuclear weapons remain in fewer hands, but a world in which no such weapons exist. We are not seeking just to reduce the risk that nuclear weapons will be used, but to eliminate both the possibility and the motivations for any such use. We are not seeking just to limit the damages from a future nuclear war, but truly to achieve a world in which such a war cannot occur. And we are sure that this is what the world community wants us to do. In my work as High Representative for Disarmament Affairs and in my earlier efforts in other disarmament-related events, I have consistently been impressed by the diversity of groups that have supported this great goal. While arms races and unfettered military competition may produce material benefits for certain constituencies in society, disarmament produces benefits that cut across all sectors of society. At the great goals of the United Nations, including poverty reduction, protecting the environment, promoting justice, and striving to protect and defend the dignity of the human individual, all these tacitly assume the non-existence of a nuclear war. In a very real sense, the constituency of disarmament includes not just all of humanity, but also future generations. It is small wonder that religious groups have consistently supported progress in this field. I recall in particular the historic gathering at the United Nations for the Millennium World Peace Summit of religious and spiritual leaders in September 2000. In a joint statement issued after that event, the participants underscored that humanity stands at a critical juncture in history, and I quote from that statement, one that calls for strong moral and spiritual leadership to help set a new direction for society. The statement acknowledged that violence, war, and destruction, and I quote again, are sometimes perpetrated in the name of religion. Yet, also pointed to numerous ways that the world's religions can work constructively together in service of the well-being of the human family and for peace on earth. Among these various ways of serving the human family, the participants agreed, again I quote, to join with the United Nations in the call for all nation states to work for the universal abolition of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction for the safety and security of life in this planet. End of quote. I have seen this or similar calls issued by religious leaders across the globe. Now, in surveying this brief history of disarmament efforts at the United Nations, one can easily see signs of leadership. Sometimes the agent of this leadership was a Secretary General, Sometimes it came from leaders or representatives of member states. Sometimes it came from coalitions of states. And sometimes it emerged from individuals or groups in civil society. And in the field of disarmament, I would certainly include in this category the work of former Senator Douglas Roche, who is with us today, sitting in the audience. Leadership is essentially a human quality to inspire, direct, and sustain collective action. It can be instinctive, but it can also be learned. Yet it is difficult to teach. It can be performed by individuals with great charisma, by people performing official responsibilities, or by people who inspire others to act based more on appeals to custom and received traditions. A leader can lead by reason, by emotive appeals, or by strength in character. What distinguishes a leader from a mere dictator is the element of voluntary support from the followers. As I have used the term, leadership clearly applies to a capability rather than to an end. One can quite effectively lead others to oblivion. Moral leadership, on the other hand, brings the issue of legitimate ends, goals that are both fair and adopted through an open process of voluntary consent. In my field, the individuals I would regard as true leaders are not simply those who prevail in conflicts, but those who can inspire hard work for a noble goal. And this requires followers who do not just understand, but who fully embrace the basic legitimacy of the destination toward which their leaders are leading them. As it applies to nuclear weapons, moral leadership means something quite different from the ability to ensure the triumph of might over right. It involves much more than seeking to deter aggression or to avoid a nuclear war by threatening an adversary with total annihilation. It involves the capability to inspire the mighty to pursue righteous ends, as much as it involves efforts by the mighty to pursue such ends through collective action. With respect to the actions of public officials, moral leadership is not limited to any specific level of government. It can be exercised by city mayors, governors, national legislators, civil servants, leaders of intergovernmental organizations, and even by ordinary citizens. I have seen many examples of this moral leadership over the years in dealing with nuclear weapons issues. The persistent and enlightened efforts of the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to advance the goal of global nuclear disarmament deserve special recognition. Few can speak with greater moral authorities of the devastating effects of nuclear weapons than the people who live in the cities that were attacked by such weapons. These leaders have spearheaded the Mayors for Peace initiative, which has now gained the support of leaders from over 2,400 cities worldwide, a demonstration of moral leadership of the highest order in the cause of nuclear disarmament. From my vantage point in the UN, I see moral leadership among our own member states, not just in articulate statements and resolutions, but also in the formation of broad-based coalitions and alignments of states that share the common desire to free this world from global nuclear threats. Indeed, moral leadership is limited neither geographically nor by a country's wealth, which helps to account for the dedicated efforts of developing countries over several decades to seek the elimination of nuclear weapons. I can see moral leadership even in the efforts of an individual person to convince another to support the elimination of weapons that can destroy this planet. The difficulty of achieving a world without nuclear weapons goes without question. As difficult as it is, however, by far the greater challenge is in trying to explain how the continued, indeed indefinite, possession of such weapons by some countries will guarantee against the use of such weapons in the future. Such possession will surely not guarantee against either the future spread of such weapons or the improvement or expansion of existing arsenals. It did not do so yesterday, and it won't do so tomorrow. Yet I do believe that disarmament, with all the safeguards and guarantees, does offer a brighter future for humanity than the perpetuation of a world whose security is based on the threat of mutual destruction. I do not believe, however, that disarmament will spontaneously appear in this world without the agency of human action. Nor do I believe that its achievement would be viewed as an inevitable destiny of human history. Quite the contrary, it will occur only as a result of willful action by national leaders and their respective citizens. I do not believe that disarmament must await the prior achievement of world or regional peace, nor the final solution to the threat of the proliferation of nuclear weapons, nor the elimination of all conventional weapons, nor the perfection of missile defenses, nor a fundamental change of human nature, and nor the inauguration of world government. It can instead be achieved as a result of leadership that rests on the pursuit of a legitimate goal, disarmament as a common good, by legitimate means, a process that allows for universal participation. I must emphasize that this type of leadership is as much moral as it is utilitarian. It serves both the ideals and the interests of humanity. As I said, disarmament is the right thing to do, and it works. Such leadership is, however, quite rare, though I doubt it will take the appearance of a new Gandhi or a Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu, or a moral leader of similar historic stature. Though no one can possibly predict who will rise to this leadership challenge or when, it is useful at least to consider the type of environment that may be conducive to the appearance of such leaders and the success of this work. Nuclear disarmament will certainly require considerable leadership from inside the group of states that possess nuclear weapons, especially those with the largest stockpiles, the United States and the Russian Federation. Yet it will also require understanding, support, and leadership, not just by, but within all countries. I believe that the ultimate foundation for moral leadership derives from a political culture that has its roots in the family and schools, for they play an invaluable role in helping us all to perceive and understand our world. Spiritual and religious convictions can powerfully reinforce the foundations for such leadership. This is one reason why supporters of disarmament among United Nations member states and the UN Secretariat itself have been so interested in promoting disarmament and non-proliferation education in recent years. And this is also why we in the Secretariat have actively reached out to religious groups for their support in this great cause of nuclear disarmament. I can hardly overemphasize the crucial role of academic institutions in this debate. Moral leadership in eliminating nuclear weapons requires a troubled conscience, a dissatisfaction with the status quo, and a profound sense of repugnance for these weapons of mass slaughter. But it also requires the hopeful vision of a better world, an awareness of the concrete and spiritual benefits of achieving a world free of such weapons, and an appreciation that we will together leave for future generations a world that is safer and more peaceful than the imperfect one that we share today. I wish to thank the Yale Divinity School once again for sponsoring this event, for I believe we have all taken a small but important step toward that better world here today. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Duarte. And at this point, I'd like to call upon the Reverend Tyler Wigg Stevenson another distinguished alum of Yale Divinity School, and the director of the Two Futures Project and the policy director of Faithful Security, to give us a response.
Good morning. It is a great honor to be able to respond to Ambassador Duarte. I would like to thank him first very much for your inspiring and rich and substantive words. I also want the room to recognize what a privilege it is to have Ambassador Duarte with us, the UN's top man in nuclear affairs, who has labored for 4 decades on the words and actions necessary to make the world a more peaceful place. We owe him a debt of thanks for his work. I'd also like to thank Yale Divinity School for hosting this important conference and the Smith family for supporting it, the leadership of Harry Attridge and Miroslav Wolf in bringing it about, and especially among those who have done all of the hard work behind the scenes, Roseanne Moore, John Lindner, and Gus Spohn, among others. Early in his remarks, Ambassador Duarte stated that the heaviest responsibilities in the realm of action remain with our member states, whose own citizens are ultimately responsible for ensuring that those actions serve the common good. That is, the United States or the United Nations cannot manufacture a common good if the member nations and their citizens specifically do not take personal responsibility for that mission. He also noted that religious communities have played a supporting role in work for the common good before going on to articulate in greater depth the nature of the moral leadership that our times require. I read in Ambassador Duarte's words, therefore, a worthy challenge for citizens of all nations to take up in each our own contexts. And I would like to treat this response as an opportunity to take that responsibility and exercise in taking responsibility along those lines. So in the main section of my response, I will do so as an American who loves my country deeply by answering this question: how are we Americans furthering or hindering the mission of the common good as it regards disarmament? And second, and in closing, I want to take responsibility as a Christian minister, by faith a member of a global family and a borderless nation. What do Christians have to say and do about disarmament? I hope in doing so to uncover some truths about the themes of security and vulnerability around which this conference is framed. Before I turn to these two questions, however, I think it would be helpful to identify 2 moral principles that permeated Ambassador Duarte's remarks, and they are universality and reciprocity. These principles are immensely useful in the project of evaluating our success or failure in the moral leadership to which he's called us today. Now, universality, of course, is the condition of something applying to everyone. In the nuclear arena, as Ambassador Duarte put it, this manifests in the United Nations not being, quote, in the business of promoting discriminatory norms, that they are not seeking to outlaw certain weapons only in some countries while certifying their legitimacy elsewhere. This critical point underscores the ambassador's absolutely vital observation that nuclear nonproliferation, which is nuclear threat management, that's what it is, gains its own collective legitimacy from its intimate connection to disarmament. He is here referring to Article 6 of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which is the playground simple bargain that has kept the world from the disaster of unchecked proliferation. In 1970, the non-nuclear powers agreed not to acquire nuclear weapons in exchange for the promise from the nuclear powers that they would someday eliminate their own arsenals. Now, the non-proliferation regime has come to feel like a permanent condition. I suspect that most people tacitly accept, if they ever think about it at all, the enduring validity of 2 classes of nations. But this is really an unsustainable paradox, a nearly universally applicable discriminatory norm in which some nations are classed as nuclear powers and others are not. Such universal discrimination cannot last forever. The discriminatory stopgap measure that is the non-proliferation regime, and it's a vital thing, I'm not meaning to diminish it by calling it discriminatory, will someday give way to universality in one of 2 directions, either in the form of unchecked proliferation, that is, universally possible proliferation, which leads to catastrophe, or in the form of universal nuclear disarmament. And an interesting corollary, just as the disaster of nuclear proliferation is universal in scope, so too the goods, as Ambassador Duarte put it, of disarmament are universal among all peoples. Now, if universality is a condition, then reciprocity is the mechanism for attaining it, most simply expressed in the Golden Rule of doing or not doing to others as you would do or not have them do unto you. Reciprocity is the enacted ethics to which Ambassador Duarte referred, the hard work of give and take that makes universality possible. It is there in Article 6 of the NPT, a give and take between the nuclear and non-nuclear powers toward a commonly desired goal, which is security through disarmament. In sum, the principles of universality and reciprocity are the guarantors of the common good, because such principles guarantee that the well-being and security of one party, whether an individual, community, or nation, will not be attained at the flagrant expense of the other. And the principle of universality is itself universal, as true around the family hearth as it is around the nuclear negotiating table. Now, having isolated these twin principles, let me take personal account for them, as I previously mentioned. First, speaking as an American, there is sadly and unfortunately no way to get around the fact that our security policy has, since the end of the Cold War especially, been an escalating exercise in removing the United States completely from the bounds of universality and reciprocity. Universality is the condition of coexistence between multiple parties who are subject to the same norms. But our security policy now strives to the opposite pole, unipolarity, wherein one party exerts dominance over all others, imposing norms over all that do not apply to itself. Another word for this is hegemony, or unlimited dominance. And we can say that it is the true goal of present policy because in every conceivable way, this policy seeks to shrug off any possible restraint. It is unrestrained in its scope of enmity, by declaring that we will militarily engage even individuals and non-state actors, as was observed last night, the transition from talk of terrorism as a crime to terrorism as talk of war, that we will militarily engage even individuals as opposed to a policing action, as well as any nations that harbor them. We are potentially threatened by each of the 6 billion people on the planet. This is a recipe for eternal war. It is unrestrained in geography, because we are at war with a network of individuals who may, after all, be anywhere. There is no square inch on the planet that does not potentially constitute a vital national security interest for the United States. Left unchallenged, this policy will certainly lead to the militarization of space. It is unrestrained by reciprocity. The Bush Doctrine, as it is known, calls for preventive war against potential threats, a commitment that is refined to absurdist permissiveness by Vice President Cheney's 1% doctrine. If there is a 1% chance of a dire terrorist threat, we have to treat it as a certainty in terms of our response. It is unrestrained tactically. The U.S. military's policy of full-spectrum dominance entails complete control over every arena of warfighting. At present, the pending Prompt Global Strike program, pairing ballistic missiles with conventional warheads, would enable a U.S. president to hit any target on Earth within 60 minutes. It is unrestrained legally. We have systematically sought to free ourselves from every multilateral agreement of international law which might restrain the future exercise of American will. It is unrestrained economically. The exercise of this policy requires staggering amounts of resources, as the Iraq War demonstrates, as does our present budget, in which we spend as much on our military as all the rest of the nations on earth combined. It is unrestrained morally. Fearing no authority other than the nation's interest as immediately determined, this policy leads naturally to doing what we would find unacceptable if done to us, from the torture of individual bodies to threatening the death of millions in a nuclear strike. And finally, it is unrestrained in hubris. The shining city on the hill, the moral example that has been part of America's self-understanding since its Puritan foundations, has of late opened its gates and gone down the hill to war, with President Bush pledging to, quote, rid the world of evil in the prosecution of our war on terror. In sum, this is a foreign policy where America's freedom from any limiting authority is attained by seeking to become that authority itself, which is a comprehensive rejection of moral leadership, as Ambassador Duarte defined it. We have thus inverted the principle of universality. Instead of seeking our national good in the common good, we have defined the common good by our national good. Now, as Ambassador Duarte powerfully articulated, the practice of nuclear weapons elimination is saturated with the principle of universality. Disarmament entails transforming a discriminatory regime into a universal condition. It requires moral leadership which inspires the mighty to see their own self-interest in the context of a good common to all. And it requires a mechanism founded on reciprocity wherein nations, peers in sovereignty and dignity, if not power, exercise the give and take of multilateral negotiation and accountability. Therefore, it is with sorrow, as a citizen who passionately loves his country, who does indeed, in a not universal way, think it is the best country on earth, but I hope you'll indulge me that sentiment, that I must conclude that the hegemonic impulse of present American foreign policy, being constitutionally opposed to the principle of universality, is categorically inhibitive of nuclear disarmament. This would be bad enough, because the failure to act toward disarmament will eventually lead to proliferation. But the situation is far worse, because American foreign policy is not simply a passive, but an entirely active stimulus for global nuclear proliferation. If we do not address our own security policy, we will not be able to advocate the disarmament that is in our interest. Think about it. A nation that imagines it might someday oppose the United States needs only to look at North Korea on the one hand and Iraq on the other to see the indisputable advantage of acquiring a nuclear weapon. Those trained in business might rightly call this an incentive, and it will inevitably lead to a human catastrophe beyond imagining. Before concluding this section, I must point out that all of this is the result of a national security policy, and so let's judge it by the standard of its author, Paul Wolfowitz. It seeks the safety of America's borders, but as Mr. Wolfowitz once said, you cannot justify a policy based on the purity of your intentions when you designed it. And a United States security policy that seeks safety outside the principles of universality and reciprocity, however well-intentioned, and I'm willing to see that benefit of the doubt in some cases, is a policy failure, for it moves relentlessly toward nuclear disaster of the highest order. Our policy inverts that which is true disarmament. It's the wrong thing to do, and it doesn't work. I don't mean here to demonize America. This is an exercise of putting our own house in order. The news from North Korea this morning that they're suddenly changing course and don't care if they're listed as a state sponsor of terror means that we all have our sins, and we all have things to take care of. So please bear in mind that I'm not here setting up America as a unique villain. It's a matter of Americans needing to take care of our own business. In the face of this situation, I suggest that every patriot, son and daughter, ought to be on his or her feet, demanding our nation's about-face. Turning now, Ambassador Duarte was very gracious to praise, as a diplomat, the contribution that religious leaders have made to the cause of nuclear disarmament. But I am neither a diplomat nor especially diplomatic, and I hope that I might have the prerogative of saying, as one religious leader to others, that our contribution hasn't been nearly enough. In fact, giving the middling contribution we have made thus far, and it's not to ignore that the genuine contributions that have been made, but it should be so much more, we ought to be grateful that Ambassador Duarte did not take us to task for our failure. Here's what I heard. That one notable achievement occurred in 2000 when a group of religious leaders, quote, agreed to join, end quote, with the United Nations in calling on the nations to abolish nuclear weapons. Agreed to join. These are the words of a people who imagine the issue to be an attractive option, a goal preferable to the alternative, but not a theological imperative, not a matter of life and death and God. Would we agree to join in a call to abolish slavery, establish civil rights in sex trafficking? Or would we say with all our strength, would we grab whoever needed to hear and shake their lapels and say, these things are abhorrent to God? I am confident that the temperate viewpoint will not lack for advocates. So in closing, I have a far different message, more immoderate by leaps and bounds. And it is this. The foreign policy I have just described seeks to elevate America above that which God has ordained for any nation to be, and this places us squarely in the face of wrath and coming judgment. I know that it is horribly unfashionable, embarrassing, and even impolite to talk about the wrath and judgment of God, It sounds like a relic of Jonathan Edwards, who delivered his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon not too far north of here. But I do not know how to read the Bible to believe in Jesus without believing that the thing he saves us from is nothing less than the righteous judgment of God Most High, King of the universe, whose wrath against this blood-soaked world is the proof that what we do to each other matters to him. I believe in this God because if we are not called to account for our violence, then I don't get the point at all. Please note that I am not claiming some special power to read the tea leaves of history for God's intention, as some Christians do in the wake of natural and human-made disasters. I agree with Niebuhr that the purposes of history far outstrip our mortal scope of discernment. My judgment is instead based upon the conviction that the very God who judges the nations also ordained human government and created it for human good, and that the perennially abused authority of the state to use violent force was given as a necessary measure to a fallen world, so that the social order might be maintained and wrongdoing might not go unchecked. But this ordination of state power is given to each nation that all peoples might be protected and secured against the chaos of human sinfulness. Who are we? God's purpose for each nation is the same. He wants America to benefit Americans to the same degree that he wants Canada to benefit Canadians. And this is why Christians oppose aggressive war, because it's a misuse of state power to seek one's own security at the egregious cost of another nation and its people. In sum, the principle of universality we've looked at is written into God's purpose for all nations. We were made to be a community, subject to the same divine rule. And in Micah 4, for example, we see the consummation of this divine purpose, wherein the peace of beating swords into plowshares is a direct outgrowth of the divine judgment settling disputes directly among strong nations. With this understanding of the nation-state's purpose, hegemony ceases to be sort of an idle error that we can, be indifferent or passionate about if that's what really gets you going. It's instead the greatest offense a nation can commit. It's the ultimate perversion or inversion of its power through the subordination of every other nation's interests to its own. A nation that is an authority unto itself can do this, but a nation that recognizes itself to be under God, fearing him, will quail at that prospect. I'm not suggesting that we face some imminent exercise of supernatural wrath. I am suggesting, however, that the thoroughly earthly disaster we court by pursuing a hegemonic foreign policy ought not to be regarded as some accident of history if it comes about, and I pray that it does not, some coincidence of cause and effect, but rather the judgment of God Most High. God didn't need Archangel Michael to judge ancient Israel. He did just fine by giving the Babylonian king a poke in the right direction. The Lord of the nations and Babylonian king was no great champ himself, so it's not a matter of virtue. The Lord of the nations wrote the laws of causality into the fabric of the universe. And if this is the case, then the hegemonic direction of America's foreign policy constitutes a fundamentally godless course of action. Those who fear God know that immoral security in temporal affairs is merely vulnerability postponed. We cannot truly be safe if we are not good. And Christians who fail to note what is happening in plain sight, or worse, who recognize this blasphemy but fail to name it as such, are without excuse, and to this I say, enough. This is a test of our belief. This is a test of whether we fear God. If the God we worship is less than we believe him to be, then would-be tyrants can walk with their heads held high. But if God is real, and he is, then we cannot bear lightly a nation's flagrant blasphemy in his sight. Now, perhaps we are afraid of being called anti-American or unpatriotic if we call upon America to limit her ambitions. But if we acknowledge that we are under the authority of God, nothing could be more pro-American or more patriotic than to see our nation turn from her arrogance in the sight of God to a humility that merits favor. Calling America to restrain her power is only anti-American if there is no God. Leave it to the critics who fear neither human beings nor God to take their pick. For our part, brother and sister Christians, let us speak the truth with fearless fury. Thank you.
We have a little time before our scheduled break, so I'd like to take the opportunity to open this up for a little dialogue. And if there are questions to either Ambassador Duarte or to Tyler Stevenson, we can have a bit of a conversation now. Are there questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Dorothy Dean, and I've been very frustrated because I got my Master of Arts in Religion degree here in 1973 and was inspired by Bill Coffin. And I've been working very hard ever since to try to bring about some reconciliation or conflict resolution. I would like to know whether you feel that we in America are worshiping democracy rather than worshiping God.
Well, I was characterized by my friend who commented on my words as a diplomat, which I am, or at least I have been for a number of years, and I still think of myself as a diplomat in the United Nations. And one thing a diplomat does not do is to comment on specific nations' behavior, what they do and what they don't do. We do that sometimes in diplomatic language. So I'm really at a quandary here to respond to you. Let me say that I admire very deeply and for a long time this great nation of yours. All the lessons it has given to mankind, particularly in the way it was formed, in the way it organized itself as a democracy, following, of course, philosophical and practical developments that had taken place in Europe just before that. But putting them in practice and putting them effectively in practice. Now, whether the United States today worships more one thing than the other, meaning democracy or religion, God, faith, I'm really unable to comment on that. But I'm certain that the very strong moral and religious basis on which this nation was formed are strong enough to keep it in that path of democracy and religiousness, even in the face of some challenges that these things may be having these days. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. To some degree, when the problem with nuclear proliferation was merely with nations, it was relatively straightforward. There were governments to negotiate with and militaries and so forth. But the threat now is, at least from the people I work with, it's perceived to be asymmetric, that the greatest threat is through these global terror networks who are funded by narcotics, by piracy off the coast of Somalia. It's a multi-headed hydra. What is your office doing to address this kind of new level of threat for nuclear and weapons of mass destruction? Because to me that's the most frightening possibility. There is absolutely no rationale to it, and of course religion is all involved with it in a very negative way.
Well, you were certainly right in saying that these questions, these developments, added a new and hitherto unknown dimension to the problems of nuclear proliferation, and disarmament by extension. It is hard, of course, to deal with these things, but you cannot deal, in my view at least, you cannot deal with these problems unless you deal with them through the states. It is the states that are responsible for doing what they can to stem that sort of proliferation and to try to control that danger. Because, of course, these groups, they operate within some territory of a state, or they operate outside of the legal constraints that states impose on them. So it's only, I think it's only through the common work of states that you can do something about that. The United Nations, of course, is the one of the places, perhaps the most universal place, in which you can find instruments to deal with that. One of them, of course, as you certainly know, is a resolution that was passed some 4 or 5 years ago, Resolution 1540 of the Security Council. And being a resolution of the Security Council, taken under Chapter 7 of the Charter, it commands and puts every state into the obligation of taking a number of steps internally in their internal organization, their legislation, their police forces, their customs and other ways to prevent that materials that are sensitive fall in the hands of people that are not intended to receive those things. It is not my office that deals with that. It's the Security Council itself. Security Council established a commission, a committee that deals with it. My office does some assistance to that committee. We organize regularly a number of seminars in different countries, particularly developing countries, where the institutions are not perhaps so efficient as they are in other countries to deal with these, I mean the internal institutions, the ones I mentioned, customs, police, and border controls, and other kinds of controls. And we organize seminars, and we have organized many, about 6 every year in different countries, to help give qualification, capacitation to the internal authorities of countries to deal with that. This is the main thing that my office does in that regard. But I think we need much more than that. I think we need much more vigilance, and also in the treaties, the main treaties that deal with that, mainly the NPT, and its corollary, which is the system of safeguards under the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, to improve the institutions, the agreements, the instruments of vigilance, of safeguards against the spread of such materials. I think there is a lot of work still to be done because of that threat, which is a new one and a very, very real one, that everyone has to be very serious about it. I hope to have answered your question.
I wish you could solve the
Unfortunately, I think it takes a lot of effort. I think it's solvable. I don't think it's unsolvable. But I think it takes a lot of effort, a lot of understanding among countries, and also it takes that I have been speaking about, and has already been commented. It takes common understanding, it takes common work, it takes the understanding that we are working for a common cause, not for individual countries' causes. There was another?
Yes, thank you, Ambassador, for the inspiring speech. I wanted to ask you more specifically about the Iranian threat. I mean, how real it is today, and do you think, working with the member states at the UN, that a confrontation between Iran and the West, military confrontation, could still be prevented?
I think we have to work in the assumption that this can be prevented. We have to believe that it can be prevented. And of course, I hope, and I think everyone in the audience also hopes that it can be prevented. It's being dealt with in the United Nations, again, by the Security Council, as you know. And it's being dealt with by the agency in Vienna also. I do not deal directly with that specific issue. But I believe, and I fervently hope, that it will be possible to keep the Iranian development of the nuclear activities that they have, to keep them within the peaceful realm. There is no doubt, and I think we should always remember that, and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons specifically recognize there is no doubt that all countries, including Iran, have every right to develop their nuclear capability for peaceful purposes. And for peaceful purposes, the key sentence here. And the vigilance to see that this is done, that this is kept under that constraint, is the task of the Atomic Energy Agency through the safeguards agreements. And the doubt that exists about the Iranian intentions resides specifically on the fact that some of the obligations that that country undertook under the safeguards agreement have not been observed fully, giving rise then to doubts and to questions about their intentions. And I hope that it will be possible as soon as we can to have those doubts resolved peacefully through diplomatic means within the Atomic Energy Agency. That is the work that has been going on for a few years now. And all I can say is that I and perhaps several billion human beings in all the world wish that those efforts will be successful.
Thank you for your remarks. I've been engaged as a citizen, an active participant with friends, Quakers, in working for United Nations disarmament conferences. I was involved with the first special session, second special session, and third special session. I'm wondering what you think the opportunities are for a fourth special session to be convened, and what we as citizens can do in terms of education and action in order to achieve pressure to have a fourth special session on disarmament convened, where the leaders could be aiming for the goal of complete nuclear weapons disarmament.
Thank you. Well, having been involved, as you said, personally in these efforts, you know that since the 1980s, we don't have a special session on disarmament. Lately, there's been some work at the United Nations trying to see the possibility of convening a fourth one. You probably know that there was an open-ended informal group established last year under the chairmanship of an ambassador from Chile, Ambassador Labé from Chile, trying to see what the possibilities were for convening a fourth special session. I think it's past overdue. That's my personal view. We need a special session on disarmament, if for no other reason, because there is now, I think, very largely spread the feeling that the instruments that have been put together to deal with proliferation and with disarmament, mainly the NPT and others, have not responded, have not been sufficient in dealing with these problems. And we have to have a hard look at these instruments and institutions to see how we can improve them. So a fourth special session would be very much desirable. Now, unfortunately, for the past few years, some countries, and when I say some, I don't mean only one. It's a small number of them. Nuclear countries, possessors of nuclear weapons, have adamantly opposed any progress in the work to try to convene a fourth special session. Maybe we'll have a better chance next year or so, but this remains to be seen. Since you mentioned that, I would commend you, certainly know, because you've been there, as you said. I would certainly commend to the people who deal with these questions or are interested in these questions to familiarize themselves with the final document of the first special session, which in my view is from 1978, which is in my view the most complete and the most balanced text on disarmament and non-proliferation on these questions. Of course, then the question of terrorism, the possibility of nuclear terrorism did not arise, so the document does not deal with that. But it is a very good document, and I hope that one day it will be resuscitated like a phoenix from its ashes.
One more question? Yes.
Reverend Wigg Stevenson, you delivered a rousing indictment of the relative inaction of both Americans and Christians in the arena of nuclear disarmament. And I was wondering if you would speak for a moment to what you see as the causes, theological or practical, of that inaction.
I think it's a shame because we're called to be a distinctive people, but really Christians are just folks. And since the end of the Cold War, folks haven't been scared. My own parents were anti-nuclear activists, and at the end of the Cold War, they stopped like everybody else. But they were as involved in this issue as someone could be, and then it ended. And I think that, in combination with a certain amount of disingenuousness in terms of government statements, like the announcement that, U.S. and Russian children no longer have to worry that missiles are pointed at each other, which is essentially like saying I've put my computer to sleep and I can never turn it on again. It's these kinds of comments tend to make people feel safer, and really, there's so much to worry about. You pick your battles, and if you don't have something that's looming over you, it took a while for climate change to get on people's agendas, and then they start being concerned. The difference, I think, and it's the challenge that I don't think anybody quite knows how to fix, is that with climate change, for instance, there's starting to be anecdotal evidence that matters way more than any scientific paper. People understand, the lake's really low this year. That's a freakish storm, stuff like that. And then it starts to make sense, and you go and you buy your high-efficiency light bulb from Walmart. So there's something you can start doing right away. With nuclear weapons, someone said last night, compared, a boat in choppy seas, there's a danger versus the Titanic gliding along a mirror-like surface to an iceberg. And I think that's the peril with nuclear weapons, is that it's a totally uninstantiated threat. And that takes away from people's awareness that this is something we need to care about. In terms of how you fix that, I have a friend who, I like diplomats, and I have a friend who's served 9 consecutive U.S. presidents in the Foreign Service. And he said, I won't name him because it's not public, but he said, I worry it's going to take a nuclear blast to wake us up. I worry it's going to take a catastrophe. My hope with especially religious people who have a facility of responding to a non-present reality. If we take Jesus seriously, then we condition our lives around a reality that's not. I mean, where is Jesus, right? And yet I say my life depends upon him. I think we have a facility for responding to non-present realities, and that's my hope, at least, for dealing explicitly with people of faith around this issue.
I think we'll call our session to a halt at this point. The conversations can continue informally over coffee downstairs. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Duarte and Reverend Stevenson for their marvelous presentation.